So and because this is where most of us get our fatwa from, we log online and the fatwa of this group are very predominant. I'm going to deconstruct this inshallah very clearly. Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, who is the icon of the Hanbali madhab, is to the Hanabila what Imam al-Nawawi is to the Shafi'is. Ibn Qudama is the medieval icon of Hanbalism, and he wrote some of the most classical books, including Al-Mughni, and Al-Mughni is one of the greatest encyclopedias of fiqh ever written in the history of Islam. Ibn Qudama was a Hanbali theologian and a faqih, and a teacher of the teacher of Ibn Teymiyye. He was basically a century before Ibn Teymiyye. Ibn Qudama writes in his Al-Mughni, and Al-Mughni is considered to be one of the primary references of Islamic fiqh in all the madhahib, because Ibn Qudama wrote an encyclopedia of all four madhahib in Al-Mughni. And he writes, volume 2, page 225, any good deed that a person does and gives its thawab to a Muslim mayyit, two conditions, dead and Muslim. Okay? So the Hanabila, generally speaking, didn't really allow the gifting to the living. That's the Hanafis. The Hanabila want to gift it to the deceased. Okay? And it has to be Muslim. You cannot gift to a non-Muslim, which is of course understood because the non-Muslim is explicit in the Quran. So any good deed that is gifted to a Muslim, Allah Azza wa Jal will benefit the mayyit because of it. And some of them said that when the Quran is recited over the deceased and it is gifted, its thawab will go to the qari, and the mayyit will also be as if he has gotten the blessings. However, he mentions the mayyit, so he's basically mentioning the controversy, that, so a little bit advanced here. Some ulama said, if you recite the Quran over the mayyit doesn't get the reward of the recitation. The mayyit gets the barakah of the Quran. There's a difference between the two. So when I read Quran in my house, there's going to be barakah coming down, right? And there's going to be a reward for me reciting the Quran. Two separate points. Some ulama said that when you read Quran for the deceased, what the deceased gets is the barakah and the sakina and not the reward. You understand? Very small. Ibn Qudama says no. He's refuting that point. That's not the case. Rather, the deceased gets the thawab. And then he says, and this is ijma' al-muslimin, the unanimous actions of the Muslims, فَإِنَّهُمْ فِي كُلِّ عَصْرٍ وَمِصْرٍ, in every era and in every land, they come together and they recite Quran and they give the thawab to their dead without anybody criticizing them. I want you to ponder over what Ibn Qudama says. And he says this is the custom from time immemorial in every asr wa misr, in every time and in every land, that people come together and they read Quran and they gift it to the deceased and no one criticizes them. Min ghayri nakir. Who is saying this? Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, one of the greatest icons of the Hanbali madhab. And I can quote more and more. The Hanbali madhab I'm the most familiar with because obviously that's the madhab I studied intimately. Imam al-Bahuti, he wrote his Kashaf al-Qina', which is considered to be the khulasa or the zubda of the later Hanbali position, and it is the primary book that is taught in those lands where you want to be a judge in the Hanbali madhab. The Kashaf is one of the main books that is taught. And he writes that the position of Imam Ahmad is that all good deeds reach the deceased. And he also mentions that people gathering together to read Quran for the deceased is something that the ummah has done from time immemorial, and no one has made a fuss over this issue. Okay, so this is Imam al-Bahuti. Now, what do you think Ibn Teymiyye, Shaykh al-Islam, said? And he's from the Hanbali school. Trick question or what? I'm asking you. Ibn Teymiyye and his student Ibn al-Qayyim, who are of course some of the most well-known ulama in the history of Islam, and people that obviously, as you know, I admire immensely, and I consider myself to be a minor student of their thought. they are very, very explicit that all good deeds can be gifted to the deceased. And this is a shock to many people to find out, because those who claim to follow these two icons are on the exact opposite opinion. And they are the ones who make a very big deal about gifting good deeds to the deceased, and about reading Quran for the deceased, and about coming together to read Quran for the deceased. Ibn Teymiyye and Ibn al-Qayyim, on multiple occasions, there are over 10 specific points in his Majmu' Fatawa that I have, and also Ibn al-Qayyim in his Kitab al-Ruh, which I'm actually going to read from, because again, most of the people who presume they're following these two authorities have never actually read the books directly. They're only getting snippets from later authorities, and they rarely go back to the original. Ibn Teymiyye writes, Majmu' Fatawa, volume 24, page 252. It is confirmed, يعني ثبت باليقين, something well known, that the Prophet ﷺ allowed giving charity for the deceased, and he allowed fasting for the deceased. And these evidences and others, the whole 9 categories I mentioned, are used by Imam Ahmad and Abu Hanifa to allow gifting other deeds like the salah and the qira'at al-Quran to the deceased. This is Ibn Taymiyyah writing. Even the salah, if you want to, and qira'at al-Quran. Basically, what is mentioned in the hadith is not a comprehensive list, it is an illustrative list. So anybody comes and says, I want to do this, the Prophet says, go ahead and do it. Anybody comes and says, I want to do hajj, I want to do sadaqah, I want to do fast, go ahead and do it. It's not a comprehensive list. It is illustrating examples. And from this, you get the principle. What is the principle? Any good deed can be gifted for the deceased. However, Ibn Taymiyyah says, it should be known, and I like this, is Ibn Taymiyyah truly is an academic and an intellectual. Listen to what he's saying. It should be known that it is not from the regular customs of the Sahaba and Tabi'un that every time they prayed, or every time they read Quran or fasted or did Hajj, that they would gift their deeds to the deceased or even to their relatives. And indeed, the best method is to follow what the Salaf did. So he is saying, theoretically it is allowed. It's allowed. At the same time, we shouldn't just start gifting every single good deed, and I'll mention why in a while. And in volume 24, page 233, he was asked about the practice common in his time of hiring people to read Quran for the deceased. So what they would do is that they would pay money to some qurra. They would come to the house, and the qurra would read Quran and gift it to the deceased. And Ibn Taymiyyah says that none of the scholars encouraged hiring others to read the Quran. But if people read the Quran and a gift is given to those charity, sadaqah is given, not a contract, i.e. people come and you just gift them from the waratha, from the mayyit's money, or if somebody comes and does it without any gift, like he just wants to do it, then the person shall be gifted the deed of the qira'at al-Quran. Right? So what is Ibn Taymiyyah saying? Don't pay people to come and read Quran. But if people come and you just give them a gift, and it's not a contract you sign that I'm going to come and do that, you feed them, you do something for them, no problem. And if somebody does it out of his ihsan, he wants to benefit the dead, also no problem, and it will go to the mayyit. Now, another point I want to also mention, in volume 1, page 317, somebody asked him about gifting to the Prophet ﷺ in particular. Can I do a good deed and gift it to the Prophet ﷺ? And he said, it is not reported from any of the early generations that they did this, and the reason for this is because, listen to this, every single good deed that you do, automatically our Prophet ﷺ gets the reward and you get the full reward. You don't need to give specially to him. Because the one person who will get every good deed that is ever done by any Muslim, and you will get the full reward and he will get the full reward, is our Prophet ﷺ. You don't need to separate and say, oh, this hajj is for your hajj and your salah and your qira'ah, anything you do. The Prophet ﷺ is getting the reward for tabliq al-risala. So clearly you do not have to gift the Prophet ﷺ anything. That's very clear. He doesn't need it. Your deeds will automatically appear in his scale and in your scale from Allah's blessing. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim in his Kitab al-Ruh has the most detailed discussion of gifting to the deceased, and I strongly encourage every advanced student of knowledge to read through the 20 or so pages in my edition from page 326 all the way to 350, so almost 25 pages about this regard. And it is the most detailed discussion back and forth that I have found of this issue in all the books that have come of early Islam. Obviously in our times there's some dissertations and whatnot that have gone into more detail, but in classical and medieval times this is the most detailed discussion. And I wanted to in particular quote from this book. Ibn al-Qayyim basically says that out of all of these texts adding to one another, we can prove that the rewards of the good deeds reach the dead when a living person does it for him. So all of these ahadith, he mentions some of what I have done, and I mentioned more than that, but the point is all of these 9 genres, he mentions a good selection of them. Then he says, all of these put together prove a principle. It's something now thabit, something confirmed, that gifting the good deeds from the living to the dead is something that reaches the dead. And then he says, and even common sense and qiyas, even analogy, i.e. rationality, proves this point. It's not just the texts. It's also Islamic qiyas. One of the principles of Islamic extraction is qiyas, that this does this. Why? Because he said, the reward of the good deed, who owns it? The one who has done it. So the one who has done it has the right to gift it to whomever he chooses. Just like in this dunya, if I have some money, if I have some item, don't I have the right to gift it to anybody? It's my milkiyah, I own it. And so similarly, if I've done a good deed, I have the right to credit somebody else with that good deed if I choose to do so. So what he is saying is that both the Quran and Sunnah and common sense and qiyas, they prove this point, that any good deed can be gifted to any, what's the one condition? Muslim. Obviously everybody says there's no controversy here. To any Muslim it can be gifted there. Then he mentions explicitly, وَأَمَّا قِرَاءَةُ الْقُرْآنِ وَإِهْدَاؤُهَا لَهُ تَطَوُّعًا بِغَيْرِ أُجْرَةٍ. As for reciting the Quran and gifting it to the deceased without paying, without the fees, we don't want the fees guy. We don't want somebody you pay the Quran to. We want somebody who wants to do it on his own. فَهَذَا يَصِلُ إِلَيْهِ كَمَا يَصِلُ ثَوَابِ الصَّوْمِ وَالْحَجِّ. This will reach the dead just like fasting and Hajj reaches the dead as well. Now if somebody were to say, but this fact was not known to the Salaf. The Salaf did not gather and read the Quran. They didn't gift the Quran to the deceased. This was not known to the Salaf. And it is not narrated from any of them that they did this even though they were so eager to do good. Nor did the Prophet ﷺ explicitly command them to read the Quran for the dead, even though he commanded them to pray and for istighfar and sadaqah and hajj and sawm. So if the qira'ah of the Quran would reach the dead, he should have told them to do this. You see what he is saying now, right? He's taking on, if somebody were to say this. Now, here's the irony. He is taking on, essentially, the Shafi'i school. Right now, when he's writing the book. The Shafi'i school has abandoned this position. Who has adopted it? The later modified version 3.2 Hanbalis. Okay? Our modern strand, those who presume themselves following the Salaf, that strand is essentially almost unanimous that we don't do this. Ironically, and this is so beautiful if you read this, Ibn al-Qayyim, it is as if he is quoting his own later school and refuting them point by point, and his own school will not accept what one of their icons is saying. So he says, what if somebody were to say, and he means the Shafi'is, and in reality it has become his own school, that the Salaf didn't do this. We say, I'm going to summarize this because it's 2 pages of back and forth, and he's basically saying, this person is one of 2 categories. The first of them is that he is saying that Hajj and Siyam and Dua and Istighfar reach the deceased, but not Qira'at al-Quran. So we say to this person, what is the difference between reading Quran and between all of these other good deeds? What is the difference between them? Do you have an evidence to separate this good deed from the other list over there? These ahadith prove the general rule. You are coming and trying to find some exceptions. The same person who told you Hajj and Sadaqah and Quran, and in fact, any question that the Prophet was asked about this, he allowed. Then you come and you bring an exception. Where is your evidence for separating? There's no evidence. And as for the claim that the Salaf, and then the second category, those who say that these things don't reach the deceased, and this is not the Shafi'i school, this is actually the Mu'tazila, by the way. I did not mention, actually I did, I think very briefly I said last class, the Mu'tazila, they said nothing benefits the deceased. And this is for them, and Imam Ibn al-Qayyim says, as for them, we say all of the evidences disprove this point. Then he says, as for the reason why the Salaf, it has not been mentioned from them, he brings a number of points. First and foremost, that they would do things in private, they didn't publicize these things. Secondly, that the Prophet ﷺ, he himself was not the one who told them to fast and give sadaqah and hajj and don't do Quran. Rather, these were questions posed to him. And anybody who came and asked him, he allowed it to do. And therefore, theoretically, what he's trying to argue, if somebody had asked him Qira'at al-Quran, he would have explicitly allowed it as well. And then he says, how can anybody disprove that any of the Salaf did this? It is an unknown whether they did it or not. It's something we don't know whether they did or not, and the other evidences prove that it is something that can be allowed, and he goes on and on. So this is Ibn al-Qayyim in his Kitab al-Ruh, and he has an entire section refuting the Shafi'i scholars who didn't allow Isalu Thawab al-Mayyit, which is the same evidences his later followers use in our times. And of them, Imam al-Shafi'i quoted 2 things. وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. Right? And what's the second one? إِذَا مَاتَ ابْنُ آدَمْ إِنْقَطَعَ عَمْلُهُ إِلَّا مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ. And he has a section how to respond to these evidences. And he says, as for this point of وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, we can answer this from a number of ways, and I'm only going to mention 2 of them. One of them, which I really liked, Ibn Aqil, the famous Hanbali scholar of the 5th century, said, this verse, وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى, does not negate إِيصَالُ الثَّوَابِ إِلَى الْمَيِّتِ. Why? This is a very interesting point. Pay attention to this. Think about who you would gift a good deed to. And then ask yourself, why am I gifting a good deed to this person? What is the response? Why? He did something for me. That's why I'm gifting him a good deed. Now, why would I spend $10,000 going for Hajj and sacrifice 2-3 weeks of my life and toil and get involved with the Hajj and the crowd and the zahma and this and that? Why would I do that and then in the end say, oh Allah, all of this I want to gift to so and so? Why would I do that? Because I owe a huge debt of gratitude to that person. Correct? Ibn Aqil says, وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. This is his sa'i. Somebody has impacted you so much that you want to gift your good deeds. This is, and wallah, how profound is this? How true is this, right? You don't gift good deeds to strangers. You don't give good deeds to every Tom, Dick and Harry or Tahir, Harith and whatever, Mikael, whatever. You don't do this. You gift it to those who've had impact on you. Your mother, your father, somebody who took care of you, somebody who financed you, somebody who did this. You owe them so much, you have a feeling, how can I pay them back? Then you go and you spend money. You go for Hajj, you go for Umrah. And Allah is saying, وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. That person helped you. That is his sa'i. Now you are paying him back. He is getting part of what he has done. Not a contradiction. And then Ibn Qayyim also says, and Ibn Teymiyye, my teacher Ibn Teymiyye, had another way of interpreting this verse, and he says, وَأَلَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. A person only basically owns what he himself has done, and this verse is correct. The verse does not negate that another ownership of a good deed can transfer to him, i.e., what he is saying is that the verse is saying, your good deeds are what you own. That's true. The verse is not negating that if somebody wants to transfer his good deeds to you, you cannot own them. It's not your haqq. You cannot demand anybody else's good deeds. You cannot. But what if that person gives you? The verse does not negate. وَأَلَّيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. You only have the right on Judgment Day for what you have done. That is your haqq. Can you demand the haqq of another person's good deeds? No. But what if that person voluntarily gives you? The verse does not negate that. The verse allows this to happen. And he says as well, when the son of Adam dies, this hadith also the same thing can be applied here. His deeds finish. And it's true. It doesn't say somebody else's deeds cannot be gifted to him. Very clear here. Yes, of course, your deeds finish. But there's no negation of benefit from other sources. There's nothing of the sort. And therefore, it is very clear that Ibn Qayyim and Ibn Teymiyye are upon the standard Hanbali madhab and the position of Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself, and it is also the Hanafi position, and it is the modern Shafi'i position, and it is many of the modern Maliki scholars as well. Essentially, to be very simplistic, the entire ummah in our times has agreed that one may gift good deeds to the deceased, especially Qira'at al-Quran, except for one small movement that became popular in the early 90s. It took the world by storm, and it has a huge impact. I also was swept up in it, as you all know, in an earlier stage of my life.